Hi and welcome to PolyOriginals with Fiona Abel-Smith. So for today's workshop we're going to do a nice, simple, easy technique and have some fun making some embroidered polymer clay earrings. This one all came about due to a lovely lady called Janice Bradley, and we have our own local polymer clay group and we normally ask anything anyone particularly wants to do this time, and Janice said, oh yes, I fancy doing some cross stitch or some crochet, something like that in polymer clay. So, not being a very good crocheter, my mind immediately went to the cross stitch and, more importantly, probably embroidery, which was more down my line. And the first thing I thought of was, well, all you need to do is have your polymer clay shapes, put some holes in them, bake them, and then add the thread afterwards. And because I'm also come from a beading background, the thought of adding the little beads in did two things. One, it covers up the holes, and two, it added an extra element. Rather than doing cross stitch, I came up with this design, which is sort of petal shaped, because if you know my work, you know I do quite a lot in the way of petals. So that's where my mind naturally went. But it was just such a fun one to do, and as you can see, I've made a few of them. My thinking behind this one was, as I say, make the holes and then bake the clay so that the thread doesn't pull through the unbaked clay. And I learnt a few things about it as I went along, which I will put the tips of those as we go. I wanted to keep this one quite simple, so I've stuck to a very plain skinner blend and let the embroidery thread do all the work and add the decorative elements. But of course, if you can imagine doing some of your cane work, polymer clay canes on this, and adding the embroidery, you really can have fun. I haven't seen too many people do this one before, but there is a lovely PDF tutorial on a blue background with some white embroidery thread, which is more along the cross stitch line, and I'll put a link to that in the details below this, just so you can go and have a look and see something else to do. The other great thing about this is it takes very little clay to make the earrings, so if you've got some little leftover bits of clay, some little leftover skinner blends, this is a great one for that. Whether you're a beader, an embroiderer or a polymer clay artist, this is one to have fun with. So let's work through the equipment we need for today's session. The equipment we need is very standard. I will be using a polymer clay blade. I sometimes refer to these as tissue blades, but you don't actually need that for what we're doing today. You can simply, where I use this, you can simply use a craft knife instead. But you will need a craft knife, some form of roller, either this polymer clay roller or a brayer roller, which is the one I actually use. To make the holes in the piece, which we're going to put the thread through, I use these little things. Now these are cord pin end crimps for sort of terminal wire copper connectors, and I'll put a link to where you can get these in the details below. Many people sell these as little sets, and again I'll put the links to all of those, and they are great for using with polymer clay. This one's a 1mm one, and this one is a 3mm one. However, if you don't have these, you could of course make holes in your clay using a needle, and this is one of the beading needles you get with clay, and this has got a pointed end on one side and a flat end on the other, and I do use this as well to help me get bits of clay out if they're stuck in the piece, as you'll see later. But it also makes quite a good hole because you can push this down with the blunt end and give a little sort of swirl round and you make a hole. And you need the holes to be the right size for the needles that you're going to be using, and I'm going to be using both a large darning needle and then just a smaller ordinary needle, but one which will fit through the size of beads that I'm using. So all you need to do is make sure that whatever holes you're using are big enough to take your needles. As for the cutters, as you saw, I'm doing an earring, so I'm using one of these cutters, and then to create the little bit on top where we neaten off, I'm just using a smaller cutter that will create a small sort of bail, neatened bail at the top. Whatever size, whatever shape you want to use. I get a lot of my cutters from the sugar craft and the sugar paste shops to do with ice cake decorating, and this one is just a petal cutter. And there are loads to choose from, so just choose one and get your own cutter, whatever shape or size you want. And of course, if you don't have a cutter, you could always make yourself a card template instead and then just cut around that. When we finish baking, we will just sand the edges just to get off any untidiness, and I've simply got a very coarse sheet of 240 wet dry sandpaper. Because my cutters are quite sharp, I simply have a block of wood which I'll press down on them to save my hands when we're cutting our shapes. To bake, I will bake on a tile, tented in aluminium foil, so you need foil as well, and I've also just cut a sheet of plain card. This is just ordinary paper cardstock, which will go on top of the tile so that when I put my pieces on flat, they don't get shiny underneath sides, because I don't want them shiny, I want them the plain matte on both sides. I will also be using a measuring sheet, not for measuring, but simply as a laminated sheet just to put something down on. This one is freely downloadable from www.printablepaper.net, and I use it because I've laminated it. If you haven't got one of these, then something like a sheet of baking parchment, tracing wax, baking paper, something like that, which you'll just put your pieces down on, which is easy to peel them off from when we have our slices and put our little holes in them for the embroidery. I will also be using just a little bit of PVA glue, just a tiny bit, because the clay does not stick to embroidery threads. So we put a little bit of PVA glue on them when they're done, and then the clay will stick to the threads. It'll make sense when we move later on. And I'm also just going to use a little bit of liquid polymer clay. I've just decanted some into a little pot here. However, for what we're doing, the PVA glue will work just as well for today's session. I've already mentioned the needles. And then obviously we need scissors to cut the thread, and then the thread itself. This is your normal embroidery thread. It's the type of thread that separates into 6 strands when you pull it loose. And I found that useful because I don't want the whole thickness of the thread, so I want one that you can put through. This is also the natural thread. It's not synthetic, so that I know it's not going to burn when it bakes in the oven, and you can bake this absolutely fine when it's attached to the polymer clay. We're going to be adding beads. I've chosen very simple seed beads, just in gold and silver. You certainly don't need many beads at all. You only need about sort of 30 of one and sort of about 20 of the other to make a pair of earrings. So I've got way more here obviously than I need, but these are size 11 seed beads, and these sort of beads are easily available from any bead or craft shop. And of course you don't have to use these, just use whatever beads you have to hand, or embellish it with sequins or whatever else you can put through just to make your pieces special and unique. To make our pieces into earrings, I've just got a couple of jump rings. These are about 7mm or about 1/4 inch, and a couple of the normal fish hook, just easily available, bought online earring findings that we're going to attach those to, and then attach them to the clay. And because we're attaching them, I've just got a couple of the jewellery pliers, one flat nosed, one round nosed. And when you're working with beads, particularly small beads, it's much easier to be able to work with them on a small piece of material, so that when you pick them up, they're easy to pick up. Now this is just a piece of felt, which isn't the best because it has a tendency to catch with the needle as you go, and the beads can go everywhere. But a little piece of fleece, or of course if you're a beader, a beading mat is the best thing you can use. Other than that, I work on a large ceramic tile. I'll be using biodegradable wet wipes and tissues just to clean my hands and equipment as I go, particularly if I'm using the polymer clay, liquid clay, or the PVA glue. And I always use a pasta machine dedicated to polymer clay use. If you do not have a pasta machine, you can simply stack layers of playing cards up on either side, and then with your roller, roll over the top until you've got the required thickness. To make 2 pairs of earrings, all you need is this amount of clay. So this is 3.5 grams or 1/8 of an ounce, and this is Fimo Soft, but all the recognised brands of clay will work well for what we're doing today. And I've gone for plum, lavender and white, and I'll get these conditioned thoroughly and put them into sort of little very rough sort of square shapes, as you'll see when we move on to the next part, and I will condition them using the pasta machine. If you are unsure about conditioning clay, I do have a tutorial with a few hints and tips and techniques on that, and I'll put a link to that in the video description below, and it particularly concentrates on conditioning the clay using a pasta machine. So I'll get these conditioned and put them through on setting 3 of my pasta machine, which is a medium setting, and on my pasta machine 0 is thick and 9 is thin. So I've conditioned the clay, and as you can see I've kept it quite sort of short, square sort of shapes, but not very even, don't have to be even, but I've kept them quite short and square because I want this to be quite a narrow skinner blend. So I'm just going to go diagonally through the end pieces, but not quite up to the corners. As per normal, flip the pieces over, and then very roughly put them together so you've got that diagonal line down the middle. be neat, but what I'm looking at is I'm looking that I want to keep this about the width of the cutter that I'm planning to use, because I want to have a nice blend across the whole width that'll fit the whole of the piece when we cut a piece out. If you're unused to doing skinny blends or new to them, I do have a tutorial with a few tips and techniques, and I'll put a link to that in the video description below. So because I've just got a short piece today, I'm just going to push those together. Do the same on the other side, and then I'm going to put it through the pasta machine and constantly fold bottom to top, bottom to top. As I do, I'm going to push it quite hard up against the edge of my pasta machine, because as I say, I want to keep this nice and short, and you can do that by pushing it up. You can also use a spare block of clay to have on your pasta machine as well to reduce the size. People use magnets, anything you want, just to make sure you end this piece with nice, about the right width, as I say, for what you are doing. So because I've got a couple of pieces or thicknesses there, I'm going to go one up from the setting 3 that I normally do. So this is going to be setting 2, and I say keep folding it top to bottom until we get a nice smooth blend about the width of our piece, and I'll bring you back when I've got that done. So there we are with our blend going all the way through, and it's about the right size to cut our pieces from. But it's a lot thicker than I want at the moment, so I'm going to put it down to quite a thin setting, so it's setting number 6 on my pasta machine, and that'll give me nice thin flexible pieces that we can embroider through. And there's my sheet. So at this point I'm going to start working on the measuring sheet. So I'm just going to put it down, and either with your ordinary roller or with a brayer roller, I'm just going to roll that so it's nicely press down and there's no air bubbles underneath. I'm going to take the cutter, and I've placed it so I've got some of the light all the way down to some of the dark, and because this is a sharp cutter, sharp on both sides, I'm just going to use a block of wood, press down, and then I give it a little wiggle just to make sure it's nicely cut through all the way down. Same again. And then, just because I'm going to do another 2, because as I mentioned at the start, it's enough clay to get 2 sets of the earrings. So I'm now going to pull the clay off, and having pulled it off, we're going to use this for the bit in a minute to tidy off the top. So I'm just going to put all these pieces back together, match them back in. And I always do this when I've been using a Skinner blend. It's amazing how often those little leftover pieces of Skinner blend will make into something nice. And now I can put that back through the pasta machine, which I will do when we've got these in the oven, and we'll make another full Skinner blend out of this, and we'll use this, say, to do the nice little bits on the top. So I'm now going to use my cutters. As I mentioned, if you don't have these, then you can use a needle or just something to make the hole. But what I like to do, particularly as we've got the 4 pieces here, is to do the large hole in the top, which will be where all the threads will come into. So you go up that way. But then I also like to turn them, have a pair going the other way up. So sometimes with the dark at the top and sometimes with the light at the top. And because we pressed the clay, rolled it nicely onto this laminate sheet, in theory most of the little dots that you cut out will stay in place. I'm also at this stage just going to trim off just a little bit from the top of these, so that when we put a jump ring in, it has more or less clay it has to go around. So I'll do that as well. And now it's a case of putting in wherever we want the lines to go. So if this is the start point, then I'm going to do 2 layers of long straight lines going out. And of course you don't have to follow what I'm doing, you can do whatever design you like, but I'll show you this one, and then, as I say, you just experiment and do what you like. I'm going to do bottom line probably down to about there, so in the middle, and do the same in that one. And as per typical, because I said it will normally stay in place, this one's not going to, so I'm just going to clean with a wet wipe the inside of this, because in theory they should stay in. And then having got those 2, we'll go probably up to about there, and about there, about there, and about there. And then I'm going to add another 2 going down, and then another 2 going down to there. So we end up with 7 little dots going down, and I have now thoroughly cleaned out my thing, and you can see there that the dots are now staying in place. And then for the top row, we're just going to go, again, the ones in the middle, more up towards the top on either side, and this time just have 1 going in between, so that's a row of 5. And then I'm going to turn it around and do exactly the same with these ones. Okay, and now I'll show you hopefully in theory as to why it's useful to leave those dots in place, because you should just be able to lift up a tiny bit of that, and hopefully most of the dots will actually stay on the measuring sheet. If they don't, they might have just half popped out the back, which is fine. So you can generally just rub your finger over very gently and take those off. And having done those 2, do the same with these. Oh, yep, that one did come all off. And those just pull off. And if any had got stuck, then I would simply have used my needle, the blunt end of this needle, and just pushed it out through from the front towards the back, so you get a nice neat finish. Take my tile and the piece of card I'd put on the tile, because I don't want shiny backs to my pieces, and then just very carefully lay them flat, and I'm hardly pressing at all. I want them flat, but I don't want any fingerprints on the clay. And because I'm hardly pressing them at all, I haven't bothered going in and cleaning up the edges. So even though I gave the cutter that little squiggle, sometimes you still get a rough edge. Because these are so thin, and because I don't want to get any fingerprints, I would rather sand these afterwards than try and fiddle around and get those bits off now. So just spend a bit of time making sure they're nice and flat. Now normally when I'm baking clay, I will say to you, follow the manufacturer's instructions for the brand of clay you are using. However, for today, I want these to be really quite strong, and also to have a little bit of flexibility, which works when they're nice and thin like this. So I'm actually going to be baking these slightly higher temperature, not hugely, just slightly higher temperature, and for much longer. So for instance, these are Fimo Soft, and I'm actually going to bake these at 130 degrees for 1 hour. And that will give me nice hard clay, and it will also give me nice flexible clay, because we want the clay to be able to take a little bit of stress when we're pulling those threads nice and tightly. If you want more information about getting really good baking of your polymer clay pieces, particularly when they're nice and thin like this, then go to the Blue Bottle Tree and look at Ginger Davis Allman's website. She also has a couple of really good YouTube videos that she's done particularly on this subject, and I'll put a link to those in the description below this one, so you can get all the information you need on how to bake really hard and slightly flexible polymer clay from that. Right, so having said that, I'm now going to bake these. As always, I will tent the whole piece in foil, so it's not touching the clay, but just to give it a bit of a protection, so that if the oven spikes during baking, it's not going to hurt the clay, particularly given the fact that we're baking slightly higher temperature than normal. While we're waiting for the earring, let's create our little pieces that we're going to be able to put on top once they are baked. So I'm going back to all the pieces of the Skinner blend that I collected, so I can now put it back through fold first, and we will keep putting it through just a few times until we get a nice blend again. And because we've got several layers, I will put it back on setting number 2. Once we've got our nice blend back, even though it's quite a small piece, I'm going to go fold that in 2, and I'm going to put it back through the pasta machine on setting number 2 to give us a longer, thinner piece. And now I'm going to go down to my thinnest usable setting, which for me is setting number 9, purple end first, to give me a really long, thin sheet of clay. And now we've got that, all I need to do is to concertina it backwards and forwards. I'm only probably going about a centimetre, just under, or between 1/4 and 1/2 inch. We get a nice little stack like that, and then I'm going to push it quite thin, because all we want is something that's the height of our little cut-off piece. Once we've got that done, you can take off quite a nice thickish stack. I'm just going to press it slightly narrower with my fingers so that I can put it back through the pasta machine that end on, so we're going to get ourselves a nice long thin sheet that I can cut out pieces to create the tops of our earrings. And I'll put it back through the pasta machine at setting number 6, so it's the same thickness as our earrings are. There we go, and we need 4 per earring. So for the first ones I'm going to do it, now I know from experience that when I cut my extra piece I'm only going to need probably just over half of the size of this, not the whole thing. So I'm going to have the pieces with the dark purple towards the bottom. So I'm going to do 4 of those, but I don't need to worry if it comes slightly off my sheet at some stage, because it's the purple end that I'm concentrating on at the moment. And then we can gently pull those up, and with these ones all I'm going to do is just run my fingers around them just to neaten off that purple end, so they are all ready to sit on our finished pieces once they have finished baking and had the embroidery added to them. Once the pieces are cooled and out of the oven, I've just rolled up my sandpaper and I'm just going to very gently go around the edges and take off any rough pieces that need sanding. And now our pieces are ready to embroider, and because they're nice and thin and they've been baked properly, they have a bit of flexibility in them, so I don't need to worry about them snapping or breaking when I'm doing my threading. So with the embroidery thread I've cut off probably about 24 inches, about 60 centimetres, and I've learnt from experience that I find having the whole thickness of the thread going through is just a bit too much. I also find, of course, the reason I have 2 needles is that I do 2 different lots of threads. The first time I go through I use just 2 of the strands of this 6 strand, and I go through using the darning needle, create all the pattern, and then because that's a lot of material to go through the small beads, I then go through with just a single thread on my needle, and that's when I add the beads in and go back and do the beads as well. And that seems to work well with what I'm doing, because then I can have small beads but have more thread than would actually fit through the small beads with a needle if I was planning on adding them by themselves. So I'm going to just simply pull 2 strands of this embroidery thread away, and I'm starting from the top and then just gently pulling, and you should be able to get the whole piece off in one if you pull nice and gently. If you find that it's twisting or knotting, it's probably because you're pulling from the wrong end, in which case stop what you're doing and go back and try from the other end instead. And for this bit, as I say, we're going to go simply through and just do 2 strands of the embroidery. So I normally start by coming through from the back, and I just loop that piece over so I can hold it fairly taut with my hand, and then I am very simply just going to go in through the hole and up to the top. And this is why we've got a nice big hole at the top, because we're going to go through that one hole several times and just work your way down. When I've finished all 7 lines, I'm going to come back up through the front. I'm just going to pass my needle under a couple of the middle pieces, so that now when I go back to the back, I can remove the needle and just simply tie off the thread. Now we're going to cover the whole of this hole over with an extra piece of clay once we've finished all the beading, and we're going to bake again. So you can have a fairly unneat area around here if you want to, but obviously you don't want it too bulky because it's just a small piece of clay that we are going over. But having done that, I will snip the pieces off, and that's our first piece done, and obviously I will then repeat with the second one, but I'm not going to make you sit whilst I do that, so I'll put that to one side and just work on this one piece for now. So I'm going to go back to my thread. I'm going to pull off another 2 threads for the piece I've just put to one side. That leaves me with 2 threads, and if I pull those apart, then of course I just have a single thread, which is what I'm going to use to add the beads. This time I'm going to go through the back of my piece and just knot the thread on and then cut off the tail. Of because I find it easier to not have the extra tail on as a distraction when I'm adding the beads. And what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to come through to the front roughly in the same place that my initial thread went down, and that's the only thing to concentrate on when you're doing this. Each time you come through to the front, make sure that you're coming through in a place which is going to be in line with the previous thread, and then when you're going up the back side again, make sure you're in line with the previous thread. But other than that, we're going to go through the first hole, and then we're going to add on one of our little beads, back through the hole, add on another bead, back through the hole, and then up to the top. And as I say, I'm going to come through the thread that's already there and in line to come down with the next one. And that's all we're going to do. We're just going to simply go through. So you go through to the back, add a bead, come through to the front, add a bead, and of course those beads are sufficiently big to not go through the holes, so therefore they will hold the whole thing in place but hide the holes and just look as though they are just sat on top. So I will do all of that in fast forward and bring you back when we've reached the end. So there's our first line of embroidery colour and our line of beads, and of course you can do exactly the same colours, same combinations if you want with your second line, or not even have a second line in. But I'm going to do the darker red, so I've already got that prepared, and this time it was probably about just over 12 inches, which is way too much, but it's easier, as most things, to have slightly too much rather than to have too little. And I will do exactly the same again. I'll just loop that round the top. The first one is easy because it's nice and clear. But for the next ones, I then spend a bit of time. So this one I actually want to go through between the first and the second, and I want to make sure I'm doing the same on both the back and the front, and that I haven't caught up any of those threads. And then with the middle one, make sure I'm going through the same place on both sides. And then again this one, because I went through between the first and the second, I want to make sure I'm doing the same on that side. And exactly the same with the last one. And then as we did before, come through, catch up a couple of the middle threads, back through and a knot off. And then I'm going to do exactly the same with a single thread and the beads going around the front. But I say each time I go, I'm going to make sure that I'm putting it in the same place and I'm not catching or getting caught up in any of the threads of the previous layer that we have done. So there's our embroidery finished. I will just check that I've still got room, which I have at the moment, to make a nice hole in the top, and then obviously repeat with the other one. And then once you've got both done, I'm just going to take a little bit of PVA glue and I'm just going to put it over where the extra polymer clay cap that we're going to add will go, because the polymer clay will not stick to the embroidery thread, but it will stick to PVA glue. So that just gives us a bit of a fighting chance when we do the next bit. So say, complete your second one, get them up to this stage, and then we'll come back and we'll add those little caps on. Once the PVA glue is dry, we are ready to add the extra little pieces on, just to neaten up the tops. And I like to add just a tiny little bit of liquid clay at this stage, because I find it helps stick the little sheet of polymer clay on. If you haven't got any liquid clay, then you could always, if you wanted to, but you don't really need to, add a little bit of more PVA glue. I will make sure that my holes are still there and easily accessible. And I will start from the right side, so with the slight beveled edge, and I've also made sure that if I've got one that I think is less neat, I'll put that on the back rather than on the front. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to put that on the front in such a way as it covers over any of the mess. Turn it on its back, either on your laminated sheet or on one of these bits of little baking parchment, because I find it doesn't stick as much as it would stick to the tile. It will sometimes still stick, but if it does, don't worry, you can always just peel it off and put it on again, and just sort of press it neatly down the edge. With your darning needle, just find a place where the hole is and just mark it to give you like a pilot hole for when we do the other side, and then repeat with the other side. Put the piece on, so it's nicely covering up any messy bits. Cut off the excess. Neaten up the whole piece with your fingers, whilst trying obviously to make sure you don't leave any fingerprints, and you should still just about be able to see the pilot hole, so you know you can put the hole through for adding the jump ring. Later on I'll go back through that hole from the back to make sure it's nice and neat. And the last thing I do, just to make sure it's nicely pressed down, is I'll just add a little decoration on the side just to help the clay stick down onto the threads. So repeat that with your other piece. When they're finished, sit them on the piece of card, tent the whole piece in aluminium foil as we did previously, and bake according to the manufacturer's instructions for the brand of clay you are using. So this time it doesn't need to be any higher and it doesn't need to be any longer, just your normal baking time, because all we've added is these two tiny pieces on the top. Once they're out of the oven and they're cooled off, all we need to do is to add the jump rings and the earring findings. So for the jump rings, I'm simply going to take my 2 pairs of pliers, open the jump ring up nice and full, and just slip it onto the hole, close it up, and I listen for that little crunch as the metal hits itself, because I know I've got a nice close join, and I'll turn it round until the join is inside. And then I could, if I wanted to, add a tiny little jump ring between the two to make them fit nicely, but because I don't want to do that, I want to keep it just a short one. All I'm going to do is I'm going to twist this little bit of the earring finding 90 degrees so that when it opens up it'll sit nicely on the earring. And then with the round nose pliers, I just open it up, make sure I've got the right side round so the front's showing towards the front, pop that on, close that back up, and I'll do a little bit of adjusting because I've moved this, say that 90 degrees, just to make sure it's now nice and central. And when it's on, the earring is finished, and I'll just repeat that one for the other side. So there we go, a pair of embroidered polymer clay earrings made from simple skinner blend with beads and embroidery thread. So let me show you another few colour combinations, because I've been making a few of these. So this was the original one I did when I was messing around and just used an old skinner blend. This was actually a mixture of sort of an olive green into a yellow and then down into the tangerine or orange colour. This mixture was a mixture of apple green into tropical green into Pacific blue. On this one, these are the same colours that I've just done now, so that was the plum into the lavender into the white. This one is a blend from raspberry to yellow to white. On this one, as you can see, I've done it the other way up, so we've got the dark going down to the light. This one was a mixture from plum into brilliant blue into peppermint into a little bit of aqua. So as you can see, there's all sorts of different colour combinations, and of course you can change the pattern and change the cutter as well. So here's some I've done in more sort of like bulb type shaped earrings, and again this is for the same mix I did with this one, so it's the greens into the blues. So there's just lots of different combinations you can use, and obviously you just need to use up little sort of leftover bits of skinner blends that you have, and you can make some nice earrings out of them. So that's it, that's the tutorial finished for today. I hope you enjoyed that one and have great fun, particularly using up little leftover bits of Skinner blends and create some nice earrings of your own, or of course go on and make more elaborate and more complicated cross-stitch and embroidered polymer clay pieces. Thank you so much for watching, and a special thank you to those of you who subscribe. I really do appreciate it. I've had great fun with this one, and I hope you do too. And hopefully I'll see you for my next one. That's it for now. Bye.